the studio, and I'm going to be talking with Jane Curits. She's brought some games with her that you may recognize a little bit, but they've kind of been modernized for us. So Jane, tell us about some of these games that are so ancient.
Well, some are, and some are still played. And as you just hinted at, some have different names now. And of course,
Right.
Natural evolution takes place in some of the games. But basically, there's a great number of them, and they're all interesting. And I think that you can see some of the signs here, some of the general things about games. Board games go way, way back. I mean, 3,000 more BC
Really?
for board games. You wouldn't think that. So do dice.
Yes, I knew that.
So do cards.
Yes.
Playing cards. You'd never think somehow that they're making cards, but in the medieval period, Egypt exported playing cards.
Really? What were they made of? Papyrus or wood?
Must have been.
Or?
No,
Yeah.
must have been papyrus. Oh. Yeah, because they were regular folding cards. I wasn't quite sure where to start today. For one thing, we're a little after Christmas itself, but New Year's was always the day we played games in our family.
Oh,
Big
okay.
time, all day long. And people dropped in and people dropped out, and some relatives were still in town and some weren't. You know, it was all kinds of things.
Right.
But these games, for instance, this one here is Uncle Wiggily, which still exists, but in a very crass kind of modernized form. And this is what a so-called, it's a board game, of course, but it's a so-called like a traveling game.
Right.
Because you were going somewhere.
And you threw dice, didn't you?
Yes, you threw
dice to see how far you're going to move.
And you moved along these things, and all along the way you were confronted with things, most of them bad, you know, where you lost a turn,
yes,
something
yes,
like that.
yes.
This game is a direct reflection of a game in ancient Egypt, Senet. Senet's board looks like this. And when you play this game, you don't just start at one side and go across and then go back. No, you make it like an S curve.
Oh.
And allegedly, and I believe it because it's hinted at in old Egyptian stuff, it represented life itself, you know, and the sun god Ra, and how he had to drive through the sky in a chariot, much like in the Greek mythology. Yes. But you were going somewhere. In this case, it's a race game, and I'm sure we've all had a lot of those. A race game where you had to beat the other person out. This one also, poor old Uncle Wiggily had to get to the rheumatism cure. Sometime he had all these monsters in between, just as the soul after death in Egypt had to go through all kinds of horrible things, monsters and whatnot, in order to get to the afterlife. So it was hinting at it.
Right.
And other games, I know the in the medieval period, there was a lot of game playing in the church. They were even played in churches. Now, some of that, I think, is that every educated person was a church person in some extent.
Right.
That's where they were educated. But if we go way, way back, let's take up common games now. Bridge, for example.
Okay.
Where did bridge come from? Well, bridge is a so-called trick-taking game, and that puts a lot of things in the category. But our form of bridge came directly out of whist in the 17 and 1800s.
That's right, it did.
And I believe the deck was a little smaller. There were variants the way there are now.
I still hear of people playing whist once in a while.
You do, yes. But going back of that, you don't have such a clear derivation because it changes a lot from these things. But coming up from there, there's been a lot of change. Now, when we talk about duplicate bridge today, we don't realize there was, I thought at first it was the same thing, it was not. But there was another one called duplicate bridge, and it was designed to take a lot of the risk out of a game.
Oh, really?
It wasn't such a nasty game, no cutthroat. But it was in the mid-1800s that whist really began to develop anything else. It turned out that they did not have any trump. And no suit was trump at any time. Okay. And they had to work through, they got a little more fun in it. So they arranged to, this was developed into auction bridge. Okay. You had to bid around, and that's pretty much what we learned many years ago.
Sure.
Auction bridge, where you had to declare, each person declared, and then whoever won the bidding got the trump.
Right.
But until the 1920s, one of the Vanderbilts decided that, and maybe you see the financial influence in that, I don't know, financial world, but they decided that you had to declare what you were going to make.
Oh.
And if you didn't make it, you see, then you were penalized and so on. It wasn't just open, free-range bridge. So those developments occurred, and I guess now there are still variants of bridge, but by and large, I think it's just between free bridge, so to speak, and duplicate bridge. But you had now this game Parcheesi is a representative of India.
Oh.
And India and that whole Mesopotamia, that mid and far eastern region in there, was a great source of games. Apparently they developed, to begin with, a race between Egypt, not a race, but who was first, Egypt or Mesopotamia. But in Iraq, all the things that were done there, the archaeologists found actual sets of dice and all kinds of different things, boards, and in Egypt, of course, too. Right. And in King Tut's tomb, they found several beautiful sets. And this set of Senet, for example, there's one in blue, some kind of blue, it looks like faience. It's just gorgeous, and with the little pieces on it. The one next to it is a game called and I believe it comes from the same that's in the Bible, you know, the place, of the Chaldees. But this one is similar, roughly speaking, similar to what it became later. A little more complicated to play, but these games you all were trying to get somewhere, and this one had much more complicated what you had to do to be able to cross that bridge, you know, and how to go out and so on. This one, you went out by taking your pieces off the board. And that's a very, very ancient thing to not just get somewhere first, not just have a race.
But to get rid of everybody else.
But then to play, to play your own off the board.
Oh, play your own off of the board.
Yeah, you played your own off the board. And it could be quite nasty because certain of these squares had bad things on them. And others were friendly, you know, they were safe squares. But you couldn't, for instance, start removing pieces from the board until you had gotten everybody out of the first row.
Oh.
And this is the direct ancestor of backgammon, which I understand is having a revival these days. But backgammon is a splendid game, really. And you have like little trays. The board is not just flat, it's a little bit higher, so that when you open it, you get a ridge down the middle. And you have to get on and off. Somebody can send you to that ridge. You're seeing you're in trouble with doing that. But the whole idea behind the games has been a subject of discussion for a long time. How come people, I mean, here they were kind of living hand to mouth, not exactly the caveman existence, but you know, what were they doing? Playing games.
Right. How did you have time to do that?
Yeah, how did you have time to do that? And a lot of it is directly related to religion in those early days. I mean, the early forms of Senet, which became just a plain fun board game, but it started out with this being a reminder and a solid, almost a reenactment of this religious, of what the sun god did every day, and then of what your soul did when you died. So backgammon isn't quite that. I don't think that ever was quite that, any religious aspects to it. But it is training, and the way it was used by Dominican friars and probably others in teaching.
Oh, okay.
And the idea, this is beginning to lead into another game that was very popular here, and that is, it was the old one was called Snakes and Ladders.
Okay.
But here it's been called Chutes and Ladders. But that goes way, way back too. In fact, we have some pictures. We're going to look at some pictures in a minute, and I don't want to chop things up. Well, there's one. We might as well start looking at some. That is a modern-day backgammon board.
Yeah.
And the way you move your pieces, one person would move, your home base would be on the right there on the lower part, and you would move to the left and around, and you would have to get all your pieces around the board and in that space, and then play it off the board. And the roll of dice is what influences that. Now the next picture is two ladies in modern day India playing, and you can even see from at a glance there that it's a much fancier board than that, and very elaborate and with all those Near Eastern designs. The next one shows way back a game of backgammon, and see the board is essentially the same.
Essentially the same.
Yeah. And then another one, the next one we see, this is a form of backgammon, but it was in ancient Rome. And that, more must have been involved in each move than in the later boards, because you get mixed up on where you were going. But you had the 3 rows. And then a lovely one from ancient Rome. You see the next picture, you will see 2 people playing. It's a 2-person game, and sitting on those little kind of stools, and inside there, and again, it's a 3-line thing, much like the old Egyptian one. See, it hadn't evolved as far away as the one did later. So when you're playing backgammon nowadays, it's been played in the movies. I've seen a movie where somebody was trying to seduce Ginger Rogers, and she kept wanting another game of backgammon all night. And yeah, so you see it comes up still now and again. Now let's look at some more pictures while we're at it. We just mentioned snakes and ladders, which in this country, when it came to America, it was changed to chutes and ladders. I don't know why particularly, but you could get the idea here. This one was also used in instruction and in karma, in some of the Eastern religions where they believed in reincarnation, and you had karma and how to behave and how to live a good life so that you'd have a better one. But the lines going through there, the snakes, represent things that you don't have to worry about anymore. I think that's kind of nice. Unfortunately, the picture didn't blow up too well, but if you could see closer to it, you'd see little figures there. Maybe you can see them now. Another one somewhat similar to that is a little bit later in history, and this one is from India, and you see the ladders, the snakes and ladders, and the ladders were places where you could go freely, I guess. But it's all adorned with these little balconies sticking out on the side. So when you're playing this game, if you still play it here, I think it had a big vogue. I don't know if it's still being played, but it's interesting how that developed. And of course, the snakes and ladders, or chutes and ladders, now doesn't really look quite like that. But we have one more picture. But wait, we have one more picture, and there it is. And oddly enough, they look more like snakes, but the modern American one was called chutes and ladders. And see little pictures in there, little kids. It was a children's game. I guess that was pretty popular. Let's just go on and look through some more pictures, and that would be interesting. Now, this one you probably recognize as Tiles from Mahjong.
Right.
And this is another, you might say, almost like a race game, but with a lot of individualities of its own, and a jillion different forms of it, with different ways of scoring and different rules. But from about the 1300s, the 4 suits, there were 4 suits, 52 cards, had developed. And you just don't think of it as being that old. When you pick up a deck of cards, you don't think, my gosh, people have been doing this, for at least 800 years. But in that, let's have that picture again, please, if we could. The 4 suits, the top things there are one of the suits. And they have 13, the 4 suits. And the lower ones show some pictures of, there are a lot of special cards in that. Right. These are the winds here and the dragons, the winds and dragons. But you had to do pretty much the same thing. And again, that pattern of the 4 suits and 3 of a kind and then a sequence. But a sequence had to be in groups of 3, you know, as it does in so many other games. And there you see all over in the card games.
Right, right.
So the card games, the dice games, you know,
Canasta and all
whatever
of
it is.
yeah.
Now, canasta is an example of a real Johnny-come-lately. Canasta does not go back to the 3rd millennium BC. Even if cards almost do. No, canasta was developed deliberately in 1939. It's a form of rummy,
Right.
which is another big group. And all of the theories about why rummy is called rummy are really fun. You know, rummy developed in the Far East, but it came around by the time it got to England. It was called something else. It was wei ku or something like that in Chinese. It came around, it was brought back, I suppose the Silk Road played a role in that. Marco Polo might have encountered it. But that Go type game was one that, Go means 5 in Japanese, and that's another one that came back, was brought back from there. But this rummy name thing, when it got to England, you know, you hear it in movies sometimes, some cockney will say, oh, that's a rum go, you know, meaning it's no good or a bad show or something like that. And somebody had a theory that was where rummy got its name, because somebody said it was a hard game or you couldn't win, or whatever. But there were several other interesting. In this country, there was different kinds of poker, and there was whiskey poker, you know, and all kinds of other things. But somebody adapted it somewhere to rum poker, and then abbreviated to rummy. And I think all of those are highly suspicious as things back for it. But the rummy basis for the game, where you pick up and you do something, and then you draw, and then you put down. There are a lot of conditions in different games for that.
Right.
Yeah. Do you have to have 2 in your hand to pick it up? You know,
Right.
Is there a wild card operating? But if canasta is still going, it had huge vogue in the 1950s and 60s around then, and I guess they were selling the sets, well, the cards, and they had special things where you turned a crank because you had to shuffle 2 decks of cards, or you had people taking turns, players taking turns shuffling and looking at each other kind of suspiciously, you know, if they got all the good cards. But no, that's an example of one that really came pretty late. But other games now, what game do you like to play, for instance?
No, I play bridge and I play canasta.
You do? You play both of them. Well, now you have something to think about as you think back. George Washington, you know, also played bridge. And he played for money. He liked to bet. He played for money.
Oh, well, here they bet big, you know, a quarter.
Oh, wow. Don't know this penny
There's
ante stuff?
penny, yeah.
Poker's origin is also not very clear. There are wild stories of, you know, Chinese words and all that, but the principle of poker is really pretty simple, and you can see where it would arise anywhere.
Right.
The only thing was, in all through the centuries, what I found was that it wasn't just betting, trying to keep the pot, you know, and psych the other people out. There were other aspects to it as well that involved anteing in, you know, like, was it Michigan rummy, where you had poker chips and you had to ante in to some of these things?
I've heard of Michigan rummy, but I'm not familiar.
Well, it was one of the ones with a name anyway that had that on it. Well, I think let's look if we could come back. Yes, now there is a
checkers.
Checkers as a backdrop for chess. This represents a Muslim and a Christian playing this game. Checkers, chess, you know, what have you there, out in their tent in the desert. And that would, I don't know if that was just hopeful, or if it really happened in those days, or if somebody just thought it was a nice, you know, touch to hint at the great age of the game. It was already old at that point. Nobody, I think, is quite sure whether it arose in China or not, but it certainly got going in China very early. The pieces changed, that represented the kings, the queens, and so on, changed by the area chess was a very big game in Persia, where I guess some various developments occurred to it. I understand that some of the people that were so good at it in medieval times actually made rules that the first two moves you could not do certain things. The classic beginnings, you couldn't do that because these people would see instantly if you say each person made 2 moves or something like that, even 2. Even 1, they could see instantly what's going to happen in the game. And if you play chess that well and you can do that, you really, whoever is first is going to win. And it's just not fair. But it's, we mentioned Go a moment ago. Go was this game, the object is to get 5 whatever your stones are, your little pieces are in a row. And you play on a board, I guess anciently it was a checkerboard, but the ones you see in Japan, saw in Japan, were almost like a little table themselves, and they were just a bunch of squared crisscross lines, and you play your piece on the intersection of any 2 of them. And of course, tic-tac-toe is a sort of pale echo of that. And it is ridiculously easy, and you can see why if you know the secret, as it were. You can't lose. But Go was very popular under the name Penty a while back, and a lot of people played it. And it's surprising too. I love to have a game of it now and again, but most people don't like it because you don't use any dice or any. The moves aren't determined. You have to decide what kind of strategy you want to try for it. And certain things are forbidden, but yeah, it's a very good game. And I've seen a game in Japan. I didn't see the whole game, but it was printed up somewhere where almost the entire board was covered. And these 2 people were so good that they just kept, diddling each other. But the basic principle is exactly the same. If you get one in 2 key places, you're in.
You're in, yeah.
But it's surprising what you don't see as well. And I've heard of them insisting upon turning the board during the game so that one person couldn't just be hosed, because they were only looking at this one view and the other one was an old pro. But that game I like too. Well, let's we've had our mother. Now this is one from Scandinavia. And when these board games, trick-taking games principally, came from Egypt and expanded, and they got over into Europe certainly by 1100 or so AD. They had come over the line and were up in Europe. And this is a game in Scandinavia. And you can see it's very much, it looks, for instance, a little like the board there, but instead of having the 4 players have their pieces in the corners, there they are out in the open.
Right. So
there were different rules to play that. And of course, different things. There's some other game, his name escapes me. I haven't been able to think of it, but that you got all the way around and you got into that middle thing, and then you had some other horrendous task that you had to fulfill before you could win. But that reminded me, a couple of years ago we did a New Year's Day show, and one of the things in Scotland, they have something called Hagatai. It's a particular celebration that they have up there, and I was just hoping that they had some interesting form, but I couldn't find any other Scandinavian ones that pictures of them. That is to say that were nice. Well, let's go on to another one. Now this one is either was mislabeled or what, I don't know. But this is around 1400. This is a playing card. It's in Europe. And when you see what other people were doing in 1400, in just a minute you will, you think they couldn't possibly have been that relatively primitive. Although drawing that looks like a jack, a knave or whatever. But at any rate, there it is. And he seems to be holding, ping pong paddles or big coins or something like that. And speaking of that, the 4 suits developed pretty early. also. I mentioned that the 52 cards in the four divisions, but they developed quite early and they varied tremendously. So looking at that little picture once more, it almost looks like the coins, in some of the tarot decks, the fortune-telling cards, or became fortune-telling. But now that's Europe in 1400 approximately. And now we look at the next one, and this very interesting. It's almost more like a slip. Is a Chinese playing card from around 1400, and you can see it represented some kind of a figure. Was that a soldier or just whatever it might be? And these things were coated in some way. I only saw one thing, and when I was reading around on this, that how they would do that in that time. And it's a mystery to me. It didn't really explain it. It's like where they got tissue paper in ancient times. You can't imagine. But now a third one, also around 1400, these beautifully tooled things. These are from the Middle East. They were from around Persia or somewhere around in that area that became. They later became different countries, but they're beautiful, and they were, of course, handmade, and you can see they represented 4 different suits. So it's a little hard for us to guess. Some of the old things had swords, or kings and queens, of course, as suits rather than as just picture cards. But now I think we have one more in that line. If we can look at the next one, we will see that another playing card.
Evidently, there's not another one from what
Oh, there's not? Oh, I thought
the signal I'm getting.
Oh, I thought we had another one. Yeah, well, I guess we don't.
Guess we don't.
Maybe I left that one off in my haste.
Or they lost it.
Put them on my little thing there. But it is a kind of an interesting thought to think that they were that important, really, that they would, to people's lives, that they kept on going and were developed in different ways. And
so you think that games maybe started developing as a teaching tool?
No, I imagine they developed just for fun.
Just for fun?
You can picture people even in prehistoric times, bones. I hope not human knuckle bones, but bones from animals. They would have things around like that, and they might toss them. And of course, a lot of times, the game doesn't mean specific things like that. It just means there's only one thing of food left. Only one of us can survive. I'll throw you for it.
Right.
Things like that.
Right.
And they would, of course, it was shameful the way they'd roll dice and gamble for women, let alone slaves, of course. So, why bother in the old days? But you would roll for some particular thing like that. It wasn't just a game. And then apparently it would develop. You think, well, this is kind of fun, Why don't we? I'll give you the best 2 out of 3, something like that.
Right.
You can see those things perhaps developing.
Right.
But with cards, where they ever got the idea, only one theory on where they got the idea. At one time, it usually wasn't gambling, oddly enough, but at one time they played for money. They played with money. They used
played actually with money.
And paper money had developed, and they would play actually with the money, which is in a way like poker, except that they don't determine the throw.
Right.
And they're there, but a certain amount of.
We're already down to 1 minute.
Well, I think.
Because I think new games are developed all along too. If you go
They
look.
are, but 9 times out of 10 they're an outgrowth.
They're based on something
these old
else,
ones.
right?
One of these basic principles of the games, the race game.